Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
George Harisson, the quiet man of the Beatles, has always remained deeply etched in the public's memory with an image of calmness, gentleness, and a touch of romanticism. Yet, that was merely the surface of a story that had never truly been told in its entirety. Hidden beneath the faint smile and the slightly sorrowful gaze was a long list of names he did not like, ranging from his closest bandmates to globally celebrated music legends. Some were openly criticized by him for their voices. Others were dismissed as hypocrites for exploiting spirituality to embellish their music. And there were even once close friends who later turned cold, mocking and ridiculing him. So, who exactly were the figures that ended up on George Harrison's personal blacklist? And the surprising twist lies in the fact that the very last name was closely associated with the notorious white powder lurking behind the scenes of Hollywood.
George Harisson was born on February 25, 1943, in the city of Liverpool. Coming from a working-class family, Harisson was introduced to music at an early age through his mother, who instilled in him a deep passion and helped nurture his natural talent. At the age of 16, he left school to learn the trade of an electrician, and only a few years later, in 1960, he went on tour with the Quarrymen. No one could have foreseen that this very trip would become the turning point that opened the path for him to rise as one of the 4 legendary members of the Beatles, etching his name permanently into the history of world music. On stage, Harisson consistently appeared with a stern, focused, and reserved demeanor, which led the press to affectionately crown him with the nickname the Quiet Beatle. This nickname was further reinforced after a particularly memorable incident. Just days before the Beatles' iconic performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, Harisson was struck with a severe case of tonsillitis. His doctor ordered him to remain completely silent until the very moment he stepped onto the stage. That moment not only turned into one of the most legendary debuts in music history, but also cemented the quiet image that would follow him throughout his entire career. However, being quiet did not mean being endlessly tolerant. During tours, George's reserved personality increasingly clashed with the exuberance and dominance of the other members. It was at this point that subtle tensions began to surface. Despite his growing maturity as a creator, he was permitted to contribute only 2 to 3 songs per album at most. What's more, the media almost entirely overlooked Harisson. Each time one of his songs was dismissed or relegated to the B-side, his disappointment only deepened further. The sense of being undervalued did not just come from within the band itself, but also from the way the entire music industry regarded him. Over the years, those emotional wounds gradually accumulated into profound resentment, eventually hardening into a bitterness that lingered with him for decades. 1. McCartney. From close friend to rival in the Beatles. Within the legendary quartet of the Beatles, George Harisson and Paul McCartney were the first 2 pieces to find one another. In the early days, they were merely boys sharing the same bus ride, unintentionally bonded by a shared passion for music. They would sit side by side, passing the guitar back and forth, patiently figuring out each chord, practicing tirelessly until their fingertips throbbed with pain. At that time, McCartney affectionately called Harisson "Little Brother."
Yet the seemingly unbreakable brotherly bond was soon put to the test and gradually began to fracture under the very spotlight both had helped create. By 1967, when the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released and celebrated as a masterpiece, that very spotlight carried the unmistakable imprint of McCartney's dominance. From this point on, Paul began to assume an almost absolute leadership role, inadvertently sidelining Harrison's contributions. Before 1969, Harrison had to struggle constantly to earn the recognition he deserved, seeking acknowledgement on equal footing with McCartney. However, most of his compositions were overlooked, dismissed as secondary works, leaving him with profound disappointment, a sorrow familiar to any artist constantly yearning for creative freedom. The tension reached its peak during the recording of Abbey Road in 1969. Harrison resolutely defended his work, outright rejecting any suggestions for changes coming from McCartney. The strain became so intense that even Paul had to admit a shift in perspective regarding the music. The truth is, I used to think our songs were better than George's. But now, his work at least stands on equal footing with ours. Harrison, in turn, responded without reservation, "I would rather have Willie Weeks play bass for me than Paul McCartney." That's the truth. I still respect Paul. He's an outstanding bassist, but sometimes he's just too overpowering. I'm always ready to join a band with John Lennon anytime, but not with Paul McCartney. Not out of personal animosity, but because of different musical views. By 1974, during a broadcast on BBC Radio, Harrison candidly stated, "Paul ruined me as a guitarist." Nonetheless, despite having once spoken harshly, he never denied the inexplicable bond between them. All I know is that even though we went through all those things, there has always been something that keeps us connected. The relationship between McCartney and Harrison, though tense and conflicted, could still be cloaked in the veneer of their brotherly beginnings. Yet for another member of the Beatles, the story contained even more shades of pain. 2. Elvis Presley, the disillusionment in George's heart about his childhood idol. At the beginning of 1956, there was a moment that seemed entirely coincidental, yet carried the power to shape the entire life of young George Harisson. While riding his bicycle past a house, Harrison suddenly heard the echoing melody of Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Just a few brief notes, yet they flashed like lightning across the mind of the teenage boy from Liverpool. From that instant, rock and roll was no longer merely music. It became a rushing current of blood pumping through every heartbeat. Later, Harrison recalled, "The moment I heard Elvis for the first time, I knew clearly that I would never be the same again." Throughout his youth, alongside his fellow members of the Beatles, Harrison was deeply influenced by Elvis Presley. The image of the young man with a guitar, singing with raw simplicity, and exuding a carefree attitude, imprinted itself indelibly in his mind, becoming a symbol of music capable of turning a person's fate upside down. However, more than a decade later, stepping into the 1970s and having the opportunity to meet his childhood idol in person, that image began to waver. Before Harrison stood not the free-spirited but uninhibited Elvis, but an Elvis clad in a glittering white jumpsuit, surrounded by female backup singers and the blaring sounds of trumpets, all enveloped in the dazzling spectacle of a Las Vegas stage. After that encounter, Harisson could only sigh and confide to his friends, "I just wanted to tell him, go back to wearing jeans and a black shirt, ditch the female singers and the trumpets, and play 'That's All Right, Mama' like you used to." A member of the entourage later recalled that these words reached Elvis. In response, he merely offered a cold smile and said to the person beside him, "If he thinks I'm going to go back to playing in small bars just to please someone, then clearly he understands nothing about Elvis Presley." From that moment on, an unbridgeable distance emerged between Harisson and Elvis. For Harisson, it was the regret over a pure image that had been lost. For Elvis, it was the irritation of being criticized by a young man from England, while he was still the center of attention on the Las Vegas stage. Yet Elvis was not the only shock that forced Harisson to change his perspective. For someone he had once considered a kindred spirit had also transformed into an unyielding rival on his artistic journey. 3. Neil Young, the voice that once drove George Harisson crazy. George Harisson is often remembered as the quiet member of the Beatles, a man who rarely showed irritation in public. Yet, in 1992, during a rare moment, he revealed a completely different side of himself, candid, sharp, and uncompromising when speaking about the music of a fellow artist. During a recording session with Bob Geldof, when asked about Neil Young, Harisson did not hesitate or beat around the bush. He replied immediately, "I don't admire Neil Young. I really hate him. Yes, I just can't stand him." He did not stop there. He went on to point out what he considered Neil's most obvious weakness. The main problem is his voice. "I might like some of Neil's songs, but I absolutely hate his singing. In fact, I even think it's worse than my own voice." These words went beyond mere criticism. They were a direct strike at the core of an artist, their voice and performing style. Even in the studio, Harisson imitated Neil Young's distinctive guitar playing and let out a bitter laugh. "It's ridiculous. He plays a solo in the middle of a song. And I turn to Eric and say, 'Well, what is this?'" Ironically, in the same year, fate brought George Harisson and Neil Young onto the same stage at Bobfest, the 30th anniversary of Bob Dylan. As dozens of major artists gathered to honor Dylan, backstage, the atmosphere between Harisson and Young was entirely different. George kept his distance, hardly spoke, and his eyes only glanced at Neil without lingering. It is worth noting that Neil Young was fully aware of this attitude. Music journalists at the time confirmed that he had heard about the blunt remarks Harisson had made about him. However, instead of getting angry or retaliating, Neil chose to ignore it. In public, he maintained his smile and spoke of the Beatles with sincere respect. They changed everything. I'm always grateful to them for opening doors for us. When a journalist asked about Harrison's criticisms, Neil simply shrugged. Everyone has the right to their own opinion. I didn't like some artists when I first heard them either. But over time, perspectives change. That evening, on the Bobfest stage, when it was their turn to sing together, Neil still stood close to George, still smiled, and performed as if he had never heard a single word of attack. As for Harisson, although he did not show friendliness, he also never publicly made things difficult for Neil. They performed together
before the audience, but the distance between them was palpable to everyone present. 4. John Lennon, From Idol to Thorn in the Side. While public attention was often drawn to the rivalry between Lennon and McCartney, beneath the surface there existed another conflict, quiet yet no less intense. The clash between George Harisson and John Lennon. This relationship had actually begun very early, even before the Beatles achieved their fame. George once saw Lennon as both witty and creative, admiring him to the utmost. However, that admiration gradually eroded under the weight of Lennon's overwhelming presence and his openly dismissive attitude. As the band rose to greater heights, the balance among its members began to shift. Although Harisson had clearly matured as a musician, he was frequently sidelined, and Lennon was the one who displayed his indifference most blatantly. On one occasion, when George brought a new demo, Lennon casually remarked, "It's okay, but not really something I'd listen to." By the later years of the Beatles, the distance between them had become increasingly difficult to conceal. Lennon did not hesitate to belittle the spiritual path Harisson was following, even mocking his passion for music and his interest in Indian mysticism. During one recording session, when George tried to explain the meaning of a lyric, John coldly interrupted, "George, don't start making me listen to more about those Indian saints again." Faced with such indifference and lack of respect, Harisson gradually became bitter. The warm, friendly conversations that had once existed nearly vanished, replaced by dryness and a heavy sense of estrangement. In numerous later interviews, Harisson candidly acknowledged that Lennon could be a difficult person, sometimes even selfish. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, he barely mentioned Lennon, a silence so weighty that it spoke more than any direct criticism ever could. When asked why, George would only smile and gently reply, "There are things that don't need to be repeated." Yeah. And although he was deeply pained when he learned of Lennon's death, Harisson never attempted to beautify the past or hide the scars that still lingered. Moreover, it was not only with members of the Beatles that Harisson sometimes showed a clear sense of allergy. He had also expressed a strong aversion towards certain other famous artists outside the band on more than one occasion. 5. Pete Townshend, the false prophet, in George Harrison's eyes. In the context of the widespread countercultural movement, when the spirit of peace was celebrated as a guiding principle of life, George Harisson steadfastly adhered to the principle of never compromising on what he considered to be deceitful. For him, music and spirituality did not merely exist side by side as two parallel streams. Rather, they were fundamentally two paths that had to be walked with absolute sincerity and selfless faith. Pete Townshend, the lead guitarist of The Who, at that time stood out as one of the most prominent figures in the rock world. He was renowned for his stormy performance style, with gestures that seemed to cut through the air with his guitar, and above all, for incorporating spiritual elements into the rock opera Tommy. Townshend did not hesitate to expound on Meher Baba's teachings, speaking of enlightenment, compassion, and messages of peace. Yet, in Harrison's eyes, beneath that layer of eloquent words lay nothing but artifice. In 1976, during an interview with India Today, Harisson bluntly undermined Townshend's image with a scathing remark. "Townshend, yes, every time I met him, he was high on drugs and talking utter nonsense. I never believed he had any sincerity whatsoever toward that religion." To Harisson, Townshend's presence
represented nothing more than empty moral posturing, a performance dressed in religious garb meant to attract audiences, with not a shred of genuine light emanating from true spiritual life. He regarded this as nothing short of a betrayal of art, a stain on the culture he had always strived to protect. This tension was further intensified by a detail outside of music, yet haunting in its implications. Townshend had discreetly helped Eric Clapton approach Pattie Boyd, Harrison's first wife, paving the way for the famous romance that would inspire the song Layla. Although Harrison never publicly voiced his resentment, it is hard to believe that the incident did not leave a scar on the relationship between the two men. Thus, the confrontation between Harrison and Townshend was not merely a matter of who played guitar more skillfully, or who held greater influence in the rock world. It was a profound struggle between the false and the genuine, between the worldly and the sacred. In the dazzling world of music, where the allure of stardom could easily obscure true nature, George Harisson continuously sought purity and courage in speaking his truth, even if it meant confronting some of the most powerful names in the industry. And then, when Britpop rose to prominence, Harisson once again faced a new phenomenon. But instead of feeling impressed, he saw in it only a burden that the band itself was compelled to carry. 6. Liam Gallagher. Britpop leader or just Oasis? Extra baggage. When the Britpop wave exploded brilliantly in the 1990s, Oasis was celebrated as the successor to the Beatles, a title that was both a glory and an enormous shadow weighing down any British band. The public expected a connection between two legendary generations, but George Harisson himself did not share that view. He appeared completely indifferent to this comparison. In 1996, during a conversation with Independent Radio News, Harisson candidly expressed his opinion about Liam Gallagher, the charismatic leader of Oasis. He looks outdated and truly ridiculous. Not stopping there, he even directly targeted Liam's position in the band. To me, it's very clear. Just look at Oasis without him holding the microphone. He is nothing more than extra baggage. These harsh words were aimed not only at Liam personally, but also rejected the Britpop aura surrounding Oasis. And to make absolutely sure that listeners could not misinterpret him, in 1997, during an interview with the French newspaper Le Figaro, Harisson concluded with a blunt remark: they were not very interesting. For someone with Liam Gallagher's personality, these comments were nothing short of a public provocation. He refused to stay silent and immediately fired back on MTV News, turning this exchange into a hot focal point in the music press. I still love the Beatles, but personally, I think he's a clown. If I ever met him, I would say it straight to his face. A real clown. As if that weren't enough, Liam delivered another sharp jab at Harrison's viewpoint. He just reads newspapers. That's why he's the ridiculous one. From that moment on, the gap between the Beatles generation and the Britpop generation was stretched to the extreme. The public once hoped for a historic handshake between two British music icons, but Harisson and Liam themselves turned it into a fiery verbal battle. However, this confrontation was not merely born from impulsive personalities or outrageous words. There was another, far more terrible reason, enough to place Liam among the people Harisson despised the most. 7. Elton John criticized for formulaic music and entangled with drugs. In the press, images of George Harisson and Elton John often appeared as those of close friends. They would stand together on stage, attend parties together, and share moments that the media quickly dubbed a kindred friendship. Yet behind the smiling photos and polite handshakes, there lay an uncomfortable truth. The two had never genuinely liked each other. In 1976, during an interview, Harisson unexpectedly made a remark that stunned the public. "Elton John's music has never really interested me. Every song sounds pretty much the same. I suppose he had a good track once, but that was many years ago. Elton's way of making music is just a formula. A few lines of lyrics, 4 chords, mix them together, and there you have another super hit." That criticism was nothing short of a knife plunging straight into Elton John's heart, coming at the very moment he stood at the pinnacle of his career. Surprisingly, Elton John did not choose to retaliate publicly. On the contrary, many years later, he still spoke of Harisson with respect. He was the sage of the Beatles. He had discovered values are beyond mere fame. In his memoir, Me, Elton John recounted a very personal moment. At a noisy party, amid laughter and clinking glasses, Harisson suddenly turned to him and said, "Listen, for God's sake, stay away from that damn powder." In that crowded room, only George dared to speak so candidly, not as a colleague, but as a true friend who genuinely cared about him. The relationship between the two was never as simple as black and white. Harisson could be disappointed with Elton's music, yet he still maintained respect for him as a person. And Elton, though publicly criticized before the world, always remembered Harisson as one of the rare voices of honesty, untouched by the hollow flattery of the glamorous entertainment industry. Their story, in a world where praise is often measured and traded for personal gain, resembled a real scar, revealing a paradoxical friendship, both distant and profound, marked by space yet filled with painfully sincere devotion. Have you ever wondered what hidden truths might lie behind that dazzling light? Truths that have yet to be seen. If this story makes you see the world from a different perspective, please hit like to give us the encouragement to continue delivering content that touches the heart even more deeply. Do not hesitate to share this video with your cherished friends as a gentle reminder that love and sincerity are always worth valuing and preserving, even when faced with loss. And remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any story that might stir your heart. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your feelings, because sometimes your very own story can become a source of inspiration for others.